Grayson from Loving, Texas. Why are recruits' rankings changing so much in the past week? Grayson, I'll tell you that, and then we're going to have another question in just a second. So, Grayson, this is a question that we get from time to time. I don't run recruiting rankings. I have nothing to do with them at 24/7, but I know everyone who does. So think about this. This is what I call bumper sticker logic. I'm not accusing you of it because all you did was ask a question, but the bumper sticker logic would sound like this. How can a recruit's ranking change from April if no football games have happened? Bumper sticker logic means on the surface, that makes sense. You go, yeah, that makes good sense. But then when I explain the process to you and we drill it down a little bit further in detail, it's not that simple. So here's what happens. For example, in spring, a lot of kids go to camps. In spring, a lot of our guys get out on the road and they get to put eyeballs on those players that otherwise they've only seen on film. Also in the camp setting, unlike their high school film, they're normally going against an equal caliber athlete and it's a controlled environment. So like if you want to look at an edge rusher, you can put them in specific drills, one-on-one with a high four-star offensive tackle, and you can see how they fare. Instead of watching them in grainy footage from their Friday night film where they're playing a left tackle that's 230 pounds and he's only playing there because he didn't have good hands and he fumbled as a running back. That's high school football. And so let me ask you now, if you were tasked with grading these kids, you had a kid's high school film, you had him graded as a high 3-star caliber player. Then you look at him in the camp circuit and he's dominating in the camp circuit. And your eyeballs tell you definitively, and you're getting feedback from other coaches, and you're looking at his offer list grow, whatever you value, and definitively, you're of the opinion, this guy's not a high 3-star, he's a high 4-star bordering on 5-star. Would you wait until October just so another football game could happen? Of course not. And then you add on to that the fact that we're in a competitive industry. There isn't like a government-run recruiting site and there's no competition. There are many different sites out there. So you're getting left behind if you have that ideology. Now that's my take on that. And it's also in December and January, the same thing I say, when we get all the way to the end of a kid's senior year and then they go to the Army All-American game or the Under Armour All-American game or the East-West Shrine game or whatever. The Mississippi and Alabama All-Star game is a really big one for most kids that are from that area. They'll go and they'll be a low 4-star. And then they'll go and they'll participate in those events and our guys will get their eyes on them and all of a sudden their grade will get bumped up right before signing day and people will cry foul. In fact, Bradley, go ahead and throw the next question up because it has to do a lot with this. You know, we'll get to the latter portion of a kid's senior year and all of a sudden his grade gets bumped up and people will say, oh, look, his grade got bumped up because of this or because of that. It's really just because you got a final set of eyes on a kid who had another year to develop physically, because believe it or not every adult male is physically developed at 16 years old. Crazy things happen in your senior year sometimes for your height and your weight and your speed, etc. So you get eyeballs on them again in a controlled setting in December or January. It's not crazy at all to think that you may bump a guy up or bump a guy down. Chris asked, what is your honest and yet humble opinion about recruiting rankings and how when an individual signs with a top program, depending on the team, they can go from a low 4-star to a top elite 5-star? It's all anecdotal, is my opinion on that. There are conspiracy theories for every program in the top tier of college football. Bama, Florida, Georgia, everybody thinks in the opposing fan bases that when a kid commits to a certain school, they're disproportionately more likely to get a bump from the recruiting services because they committed to that school. Correlation and causation are two different things here. I've never tracked this. You could go back and track it, and you could take Alabama, for example, and you could show me evidence over the past 10 years that when a kid committed to Alabama, his grade was likely to rise 300% more than it was likely to fall. And you could present me that evidence, and then you could say, that's evidence that the recruiting industry favors kids who commit to Alabama. Well, what if I were to come back to you and say, I actually have a counterpoint? Maybe that's evidence that Nick Saban was ahead of the recruiting industry on his evaluations. Like, what if that's the case? And since you're arguing over the past 10 years, Ultimately, the goal is to get the grade right on the kid, right? So if we're arguing that, all we have to do is go back and look at how they did in college. And there's that stat out there that's just insane. Every NFL draft, every signing day, there's that stat that a 5-star was X percentage more likely to be drafted if he went to Alabama. A 4-star was X percentage more likely to be drafted if he went to Alabama, which means ultimately the grades on the kids were right. So what are we really arguing here? It would be one thing, in other words, if kids kept getting arbitrarily bumped up when they commit to Bama and then they went there and they crashed and burned. That would be a scandal. You would have a legit gripe on your hands. They don't. They go there and they shine. So my argument is kids committing to Bama and then getting a bump on their grade is not evidence that the recruiting industry favors Alabama nearly as much as the recruiting industry realizes after Nick Saban does how good some kids are. That's the way I've always looked at that. And it's going to happen with other programs. But there's also the accusation, I hear it from Florida constantly. There's the accusation that kids get bumped down after they commit to a team. I don't know what else to tell you other than it doesn't happen. I don't know what else to tell you other than there is zero motivation to do that. It would be the dumbest thing in the world. The dumbest business plan on the face of the earth is to run a recruiting site, take one of the biggest markets in college football, one of the biggest fan bases, especially if you're covering recruiting, and say, yeah, I think we'll screw them. Who would do that? Nobody does that. And I can also assure you, your greatest fears are not realized because I have been where you are. I've been a fan. I've been a subscriber of these websites. And now I'm on the other side and I'm behind the curtain. No one cares. When I say no one cares, I mean no one targets any program. That's never part of the conversation. There is no conversation where Andrew Ivins goes, we got to stick it to Florida. Okay, how are we going to do it? And there's no conversation where Wiltfong goes, amen, brother. Let's bump down that linebacker, that corner, and that safety. And then Pategna walks in and says, why? And they in unison say, because it's Florida. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I know that you can pull up examples. I know you guys, not all you guys, and it's not just Florida. I'm just using them as an example. Miami, it's like the state of Florida. But Miami also is a fan base that I'll have folks in my DMs, they'll put together a list of like 5 or 6 kids who committed and then their grades dropped and they'll say, how do you explain this? This goes beyond coincidence. No, it doesn't. It doesn't go beyond coincidence. You just took the right kind of snapshot. I could counter with a snapshot of kids whose grades went up after they committed. So my final question is, if that's really the conspiracy, if they're really just knocking kids a star rating just because of the school they committed to, why wouldn't they just do it across the board? What, are they just trying to hide themselves when they occasionally give the token bump up? How do they decide which kid gets bumped down and which kid gets bumped up? People overthink the room on this. The reason I speak so fervently is because I used to think this. I'm being real with you. Back once upon a time, I used to think all that stuff was true. I thought that there, behind the curtain in the recruiting industry, was this cabal of people, and they had their favorites, and they had the teams they didn't like, and they just conspired to, engineer the rankings the way they wanted them to. I hate to be the bearer of bad news because I actually wanted it to be the case. It's not the case. You'll either believe me or you won't. It's not the case.